This story today is so raw it cuts deep. Set against icy mountains, howling winds, and endless white silence. It's a place where a runaway bride and a feared warrior collide at the edge of survival. Where fate doesn't ask permission. It begins with one desperate escape. A single choice that was small enough to whisper, yet powerful enough to rewrite a woman's entire destiny at Ashen Vows. Before we kick off this adventure, don't forget to hit like on the video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Elira Wayne's breath smoked white in the bitter air, every sharp inhale marking the panic of her escape. Behind her stretched the stifling safety of a life she had never chosen. A future locked tight by a cold arrangement, binding her to a man whose cruelty was spoken of as often as his fortune. Ahead rose the jagged, snow-clogged spine of the Rocky Mountains, offering another kind of death, one she would meet on her own terms. Yet the wilderness keeps its own bargains, and in its merciless depths she would pass from one form of captivity into another, into the hands of a warrior whose savagery rode the wind itself, a man whose people would decide whether she lived or vanished. This is the tale of a woman who slipped the bars of a gilded cage, only to be caught in the brutal, unclaimed heart of the American West. Inside the Wayne mansion, gaslights flickered and threw restless shadows across the lavish parlor. They twisted over patterned walls and heavy curtains, turning luxury into something uneasy, less a refuge than a carefully staged trap. Seated stiffly on a velvet settee, Elira Wayne watched the final sliver of daylight sink into the Montana night. The sun bled away behind distant peaks, a quiet daily ending that echoed the slow dimming inside her chest. Her father, Merton Wayne, a man with ambition as wide and merciless as the land he meant to master, paced before the marble hearth. His boots, polished to a hard shine, pressed deep into the thick carpet with each impatient stride. The face he usually wore, controlled, precise, was lit now by a victorious spark that chilled Elira deeper than the winter air. He treated the world like a board of pieces and positions, and tonight he was ready to make his boldest sacrifice. "He'll arrive any minute, Elira," Merton said, his voice full of a forced warmth that scraped against her nerves. He paused to straighten a silver-framed photograph on the mantel, an image of a happier family that felt like it belonged to another lifetime. Rasker Holt is a man of substance. His mines bring in more profit than any others in the territory. Why, this match, this alliance, will secure our standing for generations. Rasker Holt. The name burned bitter on her tongue. He was shaped from the same unforgiving rock as the mountains rising over the town of Three Forks. At 45, he was more than twice her age, thick-set and indulgent, with a temper said to rise as fast and deadly as a flash flood. Rumors trailed him everywhere, of merciless deals, ruined men, broken families. Tales whispered by townsfolk who feared him even as they coveted his power. And this man, blunt and brutal, was meant to be her husband. Elira's hands, hidden within the folds of her silk dress, curled into pale fists. Her nails bit into her skin, a small, sharp pain that kept her anchored as despair threatened to swallow her whole. For weeks she had pleaded, argued, begged. She had reached for memories of the father who once read her stories, who had taught her to ride beneath open skies. That man no longer existed. In his place stood a calculating tactician, unmoved by emotion. Her protests had struck him like pebbles against stone. Merton Wayne did not bend to a daughter's tears. To him, she was not flesh and blood, but a polished asset to be traded for advantage. Her mother, Bryn, offered no refuge. She sat by the window in a tall-backed chair, embroidery idle in her lap. Years ago, she had faded into the corners of the grand rooms her husband commanded. Her eyes, once bright like Elira's, now stayed lowered, her spirit dry and fragile, like a leaf long stripped of life. She had learned the truth the hard way. To cross Merton Wayne was to invite a punishment that never shouted. His anger came quiet and sharp, slicing like a north wind that left frost instead of bruises. She had once tried to speak for Elira, and the week of frozen silence that followed had broken her resolve. Since then, she offered only weary words, meant to soothe rather than save. It is a woman's duty, Elira. You will be provided for. Provided for, yes. But comfort was a poor stand-in for joy. The crunch of carriage wheels on the gravel drive announced the arrival of the man chosen to claim her. A knot of ice tightened in Elira Wayne's stomach. The maid, a young Irish girl named Lottie Price, hurried to the door. In moments, Elira would be presented, properly, politely, like an offering laid out to be judged. The thought of his thick fingers closing over her hand, the sour bite of whiskey on his breath, the way his eyes would roam without shame. It felt like a trespass she could not, would not endure. Rasker Holt filled the doorway, broad and bullish beneath a fine wool coat that failed to hide the brute strength of his frame. His face was flushed, his eyes small and calculating, sunk deep in fleshy hollows. In one hand, he carried a bouquet of hothouse roses, their harsh red a violent streak against the muted parlor, as misplaced as he was. "Merton, my good man," Holt boomed. He passed the flowers to Lottie Price without looking, his gaze already fixed on Elira. He stepped closer, his stare stripping away pretense. And this must be Miss Wayne. Even lovelier than the rumors, my dear. Elira rose and managed a cool, practiced curtsy. "Mr. Holt." The meal that followed was an exercise in endurance. Holt claimed the table with his voice, filling the room as he bragged about a fresh silver find, a land deal that had outplayed the railroad, the way he had crushed a union dispute at his mine. He ate greedily, red wine staining his lips and shirt front. His compliments came thick and leering, praising Elira's breeding and delicacy, as though she were a prized mare under inspection. He spoke easily of their future, of the grand house he would build, of the sons she would give him to carry his name. Each promise felt like another nail driven home. Merton Wayne laughed and poured more wine, savoring the success of his bargain. Across the table, Bryn Wayne barely touched her food. Her silence spoke louder than words, a quiet surrender that left Elira feeling frighteningly alone. During dessert, a dense chocolate torte, Holt reached across the table and closed his heavy, warm hand over hers. His grip was damp and possessive. "We will be very happy, you and I," he said, his thumb moving slowly along her skin, raising a chill that crawled up her spine. "I will give you everything a woman could ever want." In that moment, beneath the weight of his touch and her father's satisfied gaze, Elira's despair hardened into resolve. She would not be laid on the altar of Merton Wayne's ambition. She would not remain a bird in a polished cage, fading until she mirrored her mother's quiet ruin. She would fly, or she would die trying. Later that night, long after the house fell still and the stink of Holt's cigar smoke finally lifted, Elira acted. She had been preparing for weeks, ever since the engagement was announced. What began as a desperate daydream had sharpened into a careful plan. She had hidden supplies, piece by piece, a small oilskin pouch of dried beef, a few pilfered hardtack biscuits, a full flask of water, and a compact hunting knife taken from her father's study. Small, but wickedly sharp. She had also hidden away a small pouch of coins and her mother's pearl earrings. An act that stung, but one she could not afford to regret. She dressed herself not in silk, but in the toughest riding clothes she owned, pulling on wool trousers she had bought from the town tailor under the pretense of a gift for a cousin. In the blue-gray hush before dawn, her movements were quick and soundless. Inside her bedroom, more cell than sanctuary despite its fine furnishings, she left a note on the pillow. The message was brief, sharp with defiance, meant for her father alone. A single tear blurred the ink where it fell. I will not be claimed. I choose my own path. Do not follow me. Leaving the house proved easier than she had expected. The servants slept deep in their attic quarters. Elira Wayne slipped through the familiar corridors like a ghost, her heart slamming against her ribs, loud in the heavy silence. She headed straight for the stables, the cold Montana night striking her skin like a slap that snapped her fully awake. Her beloved mare, a spirited Appaloosa named Frostline, lifted her head and nickered softly, warm breath clouding the lantern glow. Elira laid a calming hand against the horse's neck, murmuring low words meant only for her, a quiet promise of the freedom they would chase together. With practiced efficiency, she saddled Frostline, every motion deliberate and spare. Time mattered. She knew Merton Wayne's fury, once unleashed, would be relentless. The note would not stop him. Pride and control would drive him to hunt her down. She led Frostline from the stable into the moon-washed grounds beyond. Far ahead, the jagged white teeth of the Bridger Mountains cut into the sky, a brutal, unforgiving wall of stone and ice. Many had died there. Yet to Elira, they were not a threat. They were her only chance. Those peaks marked the lone road toward a life that belonged to her, however dangerous it might be. Anything was better than the certainty of ruin that awaited her beside Rasker Holt. She mounted Frostline and sent her into a gallop, leaving the trimmed lawns and choking luxury behind. The wind tore at her hair like a wild hand. For the first time in years, Elira felt something dangerously close to joy. She was no longer a piece on her father's board. She was a fugitive, racing into the vast, lawless West. And she was free, if only for the moment. That rush, sharp and intoxicating, did not last. The farther she rode from the ordered world of her father's estate, the more Montana revealed its indifference. Gentle foothills of gold grass and scattered pine gave way to steeper ground, their beauty darkening into threat. The trails narrowed and twisted, loose shales skidding beneath Frostline's hooves. The mare moved with calm assurance, sure-footed and steady, a confidence Elira leaned on. Frostline's breath steamed in the cold morning air, matching the frantic rhythm pounding in Elira's chest. Elira began to feel the cost. Clothes that had felt sensible indoors offered little shield against the cutting wind pouring down from the high peaks. Hunger crept in, slow and persistent, a hollow ache that the dried beef and hard biscuits could only dull for a while. Each mouthful was measured, a thin defense against the emptiness spreading inside her. She pressed on, driven by a raw fear of being caught. She imagined her father's face, not worried, but tight with calculated fury. Her father's pride might have been bruised, but it was the image of Rasker Holt that truly drove her onward. That memory gave Elira Wayne the strength to ignore the deep ache settling into her muscles and the tight fear coiled in her chest. The thought of Holt's hungry grin, his claiming stare, the clammy weight of his touch terrified her far more than any wolf or mountain cat ever could. The first days melted together into a dull, punishing rhythm. Ride until exhaustion, rest in shallow, uneasy snatches, then ride again. She followed a faint game trail, little more than a suggestion through the land, winding higher and higher into the mountain's core. The air thinned and sharpened, each breath biting her lungs with cold. The country changed into something harsh and merciless, a brutal sweep of stone, snow, and ice. Peaks that once looked distant and hopeful now towered over her like uncaring giants, their slopes blinding white beneath the unforgiving sun. Color drained from the world, leaving only gray, white, and the deep, frozen blue of the sky. On the fourth day, she nearly collapsed with relief when she found an abandoned trapper's cabin, a rough log shelter half buried in snowdrifts. For a few precious hours, she had walls and a roof, a break from the relentless wind. Inside, she discovered a small stack of firewood and a tin of coffee, still half full. Curled beside a weak, crackling fire, she sipped the bitter drink and let herself feel safe for the first time in days. Perhaps she could stay here, just long enough to ease the pain from her body. That fragile comfort shattered when she heard it, the distant sound of a rider. Peering through a narrow crack in the logs, she saw a lone horseman moving slowly across the valley below. She couldn't be sure at that distance, but the man's build, the way he sat his saddle, felt wrong in her gut. It could have been one of Merton Wayne's hands, or worse, someone sent by Holt. Panic seized her hard. She stamped out the fire at once, smoke now a dangerous signal. Snatching up her few supplies, she fled the cabin and hurried to where Frostline waited, hidden among the pines, her heart hammering wildly. She didn't pause to see whether the rider turned her way. The chance alone was enough. The mountains were her only shelter now. She urged Frostline harder, fear biting deep. The land grew meaner with every mile. One afternoon, as they crossed a narrow, treacherous pass, a shelf of snow clung high above them along the cliff face. Then everything unraveled. Without warning, a violent blast of wind tore down the mountainside, screaming like something alive. The force was overwhelming, hurling loose rock and heavy wet snow down toward them in a roaring rush. Startled by the sudden fury, Frostline reared, her cry swallowed by the wind. Elira, her hands numb with cold, lost her grip and was thrown from the saddle. She struck the ground hard, breath ripped from her lungs as pain exploded through her body. A sharp, burning agony tore through her left ankle, followed by a wave of sickness and dizziness. She dragged herself onto her elbows and looked up at Frostline. The mare's eyes were wide with terror as she scrambled on the shifting scree. In her frantic struggle to regain balance, Frostline slid on a hidden patch of ice beneath the snow. Her leg twisted at a sickening, impossible angle. The sharp crack that followed cut through the sudden silence, a sound that would haunt Elira forever. Frostline screamed, a raw, broken sound of pure pain that shattered Elira's heart. She dragged herself across the frozen ground toward Frostline, forgetting her own screaming pain in the face of her mare's suffering. The sight stopped her cold. The leg was shattered beyond hope, bone jutting through torn flesh, bright red spilling across the untouched snow. Tears ran freely down Elira Wayne's face, freezing as they fell against her skin. She knew, felt it like a blow to the chest, that nothing could be done. Out here, a broken leg meant only one ending. To walk away would be to leave Frostline to a slow, merciless death from infection or whatever predators found her first. There was a single choice left. One last, unbearable mercy she could give the creature that had carried her this far. Her hands shook as she reached for the hunting knife at her belt. Once, that blade had stood for defiance and escape. Now it felt heavy, unforgiving, like a betrayal she would carry forever. Elira crawled to Frostline's head and stroked the soft curve of her muzzle, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, the words swallowed by ragged sobs. "I'm so sorry, my brave girl. Thank you." She pressed a final kiss to the mare's forehead. Then, with one swift, desperate motion, she ended the suffering. What followed was a silence so complete it felt crushing, broken only by the low wind and Elira's own fractured cries. She was alone, utterly, completely alone, stranded in the heart of the frozen mountains with a ruined ankle and no horse. Her few supplies lay scattered among rocks and snow, most of them lost where they had fallen. The sun slid toward the jagged edge of the horizon, and the cold deepened fast. Hopelessness seeped into her bones, colder than the wind itself, wrapping her tight. Night came down hard, a starless black. Elira crouched beside a boulder, using it as meager shelter against the cutting gusts. Her ankle pulsed with relentless pain, each beat sharp and unforgiving. Grief tore at her, raw and open, and the fear of the long night ahead pressed on her chest until it was hard to breathe. She had been foolish to think she could outmatch this land. A sheltered girl, soft and untested, she had traded a gilded cage for a frozen grave. As she slipped into a restless, pain-soaked sleep, she wondered if dawn would ever come. When the first thin light finally brushed the peaks with pale pink and gold, its beauty was distant and uncaring, lost on her. She woke wrapped in agony and despair. Her ankle had swollen grotesquely, bruised purple and blue, throbbing with a deep, burning pain. Cold had settled deep in her overnight, shaking her body with violent shivers, her teeth clacking without mercy. The world felt dull and distant, her thoughts slow, thickened by the cold. She understood one thing clearly. She could not stay. To remain was to give herself over to the mountains, to become another frozen name no one would ever know. Somewhere inside, a spark of defiance flickered back to life. With grim determination, she tore a strip from her petticoat and bound her ankle tight, forcing it into place. Using the hunting knife, she hacked at a fallen pine branch until she shaped a crude crutch. The work left her dizzy, her breath coming in shallow gasps. When she tried to stand, darkness rushed in at the edges of her sight, and she collapsed back into the snow, crying out as pain tore through her leg once more. She lay still for a long stretch, the pull to close her eyes and surrender nearly winning. Then the picture of Rasker Holt's smug triumph rose in her mind, followed by Merton Wayne's cold, satisfied stare, and it forced Elira Wayne back to her feet. She would not hand them the pleasure of her defeat. She started down the mountainside, limping inch by inch. Each step sent a violent jolt up her leg, pain bursting and spreading with every movement. What had once looked grand and open from the saddle had become a cruel maze of stone and ice, a landscape built to break the unwary. She tripped over rocks buried beneath snow, skidded across slick ice, and fell more times than she could remember. Every spill was another fight, another decision to rise instead of staying down. Hands once meant for piano keys and fine stitching were scraped raw and bleeding from clawing at frozen ground. Her riding clothes hung in tatters, useless against the biting cold. Days dissolved into one another, an endless smear of pain, hunger, and bone-deep exhaustion. Time lost meaning. Her world narrowed to the next step, the next shallow breath. The immense silence of the wilderness felt mocking in its indifference. The sun hovered pale and distant in the washed-out sky, giving little warmth. Night was worse. Waking terror filled with cold, unseen howls and the relentless whisper of despair gnawing at her thoughts. She was no longer Elira Wayne of Three Forks, no polished debutante with a guarded future. She was a wounded creature, driven by a single instinct: survive. She stood on the edge of surrender, tempted to lie down and let the snow take her when she noticed it. At first, she thought it a trick of exhaustion, a thin thread of smoke barely visible, drifting up from a stand of trees far below. Then hope, something she believed long dead, flickered weakly back to life. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant people. It did not matter who they were, trappers, miners, even outlaws. Any fate was better than the slow, lonely, freezing death closing in around her. With a final surge of will, she pressed on. Her gaze locked onto that fragile ribbon of smoke as though it were a promise. Reaching the valley floor took what felt like forever, most of a day spent in agony. Her body screamed with every step, but her mind refused to look away from that single point of hope. As she drew closer, heart pounding with fear and longing, she saw a small, temporary camp tucked into a sheltered clearing. A rough lean-to of branches and hides stood beside a crackling fire. A line of freshly caught fish smoked over the flames, their rich scent cutting through her hunger like a blade. Then she saw the man by the fire, and her hand tightened on the crude crutch as she stopped short. He was tall and powerfully built, long black hair braided and threaded with eagle feathers. His skin held the deep, burnished tone of someone shaped by sun and wind. High cheekbones and a severe mouth gave his face a hard, unreadable calm. He wore buckskin leggings and a heavy fur-lined tunic. A quiver of arrows rested across his back, and a longbow leaned against a nearby tree. He was a mountain warrior, Native American. And he was watching her. The hope that had carried Elira this far twisted instantly into a sharper fear. She had grown up on frontier stories whispered by frightened settlers. Tales of the tribes who lived in these ranges, painted as fierce, merciless, and deeply distrustful of white intruders. She had escaped one danger only to walk straight into another. The warrior did not speak. His dark, unreadable eyes tracked her every step as Elira Wayne limped into the clearing, battered and barely standing. He did not move to help her. There was no sign of welcome, no hint of threat. He simply stood there, silent, solid, set against the snowbound mountains like a figure carved from the land itself. Elira, drained and burning with pain, understood she had no choice left but to beg. "Please," she rasped, her voice hoarse and cracked from thirst and days of silence. "I need help. My horse fell." The words slipped out thin and weak. The warrior did not answer. His gaze stayed fixed on her, calm and measuring, as though she were some strange creature that had wandered into his territory, something to be judged rather than pitied. Desperation hardened into courage. Elira straightened as much as she could, forcing strength into her voice. "My name is Elira Wayne." She swallowed and continued, clearer now. "I've been lost in these mountains for days. I need food. And I believe my ankle is broken." Not a flicker crossed his face. He stepped toward her, slow, deliberate. His movement was smooth and soundless, the advance of a predator who did not hurry. He circled her once, eyes cataloging everything: the torn finery of her clothes, the blood on her hands, the crude splint biting into her swollen ankle. There was nothing personal in his inspection. It was precise, detached. He stopped close enough that she could feel the heat from his body, close enough to see the fine beadwork sewn into his tunic. Then he reached out. His fingers closed beneath her chin, gentle but firm, and tilted her face upward. His eyes, moments ago distant, burned now with a depth that made her breath catch. Dark and ancient. They held something unknowable, something that sent a shiver through her bones. "You are far from your people, little bird," he said. His voice was low, rough, carrying a weight that seemed to vibrate through her. "You have crossed onto the land of the Skyhorn clan." He released her and turned away, a clear dismissal. Elira's fragile hope shattered. He was going to leave her here to die. Then he spoke again, his words calm and final, colder than the wind. "You belong to me now." The warrior, Kor, as she would later learn, was a man of deep silence, a quiet as broad and unyielding as the mountains themselves. He did not treat her with the brutality she had feared. Instead, his distance was measured, almost clinical, and in its own way, just as unsettling. He was not her host. He was not her tormentor. He was her keeper. He knelt and examined her ankle with practiced efficiency. Without warning, he reset the bone with a sharp, decisive motion that tore the breath from her lungs. Pain flared white-hot, then slowly ebbed as he bound it tight. He fashioned splints from stripped branches and pressed a dark, pungent herbal poultice against the swelling until the throbbing dulled. He handed her smoked fish and a skin of cold water without a word. The gesture carried no warmth, only necessity. A dead captive, she understood, would be useless. Elira was left trembling in a storm of feeling. Gratitude for the food and care tangled tightly with raw, animal fear. She was a prisoner now, held by a man whose people were known for their fierceness and their hard-earned distrust of the settlers who pressed ever deeper into their lands. She was entirely at his mercy. As Kor moved about the spare camp with quiet purpose, Elira watched him closely, knowing that for the first time in her life, her fate rested wholly in another's hands. Every movement Kor made carried quiet intention, guided by an instinctive bond with the land around him. He moved without wasted motion, silent and sure, holding a contained strength that was both mesmerizing and unsettling. This harsh country did not resist him, it accepted him. He belonged to it as naturally as wind over stone. Time slipped by, counted only by sunrise and dusk, and an unspoken rhythm formed between them. At first light, Kor would vanish into the timber with his bow, returning hours later with a rabbit, a grouse, or fish pulled from icy water. With brief gestures and the rare clipped word, he showed Elira Wayne how to skin the animals and prepare the meat. As her ankle healed, slowly, painfully, Elira kept the fire fed, hauled water from the nearby stream, and tended the small camp. Words were scarce. They spoke instead through glances, movements, and the occasional low command from Kor in his own language. Sounds she began to recognize, even if she did not yet understand them. In the long, quiet evenings, seated on opposite sides of the fire, the sky stretched overhead in a spill of stars like scattered sparks. Elira caught herself watching him. The fear that had once frozen her blood eased, replaced by reluctant respect, and something deeper she did not yet dare name. She saw steadiness in his eyes, a strength that did not need display. Lines etched into his face told of endurance and loss. He was nothing like the crude monster from frontier tales. He was complex, proud, bound to his people and their way of living, a guardian rather than a brute. One night, as a heavy snowstorm closed in and wrapped their shelter in white, a lone wolf's howl cut through the darkness. Elira startled at the sound, tightening her fur wrap around her shoulders. Kor, who had been sharpening his knife by firelight, looked up, his face unreadable in the flicker. "They are the voices of our ancestors," he said, his voice low and steady. "They sing of the hunt. They watch over us." It was more than he had spoken at once since claiming her. His certainty, simple and unshaken, opened a narrow crack in the silence that had stood between them. Before she could stop herself, Elira whispered, "Tell me about your people." Kor did not answer right away. He stared into the flames, eyes dark and distant, and she thought the moment had passed. Then he began to speak. He told her of the Skyhorn clan, named for the great bird whose shadow once guided them. He spoke of their long history, of respect for the land and every living thing upon it. He said the rocks, the rivers, the animals, all carried spirit. Quiet anger entered his voice as he spoke of the changes her people had brought. The iron horse cutting through sacred ground, the talking wires humming Chuju messages across stolen land, treaties spoken with fine words and broken without care. As he spoke, Elira no longer saw a captor, but a man fighting to hold onto a world slipping away. In his eyes, she saw pain, restrained fury, and a fierce resolve to protect what remained. He spoke of his wife Yara and their young son Nilo, taken by the white man's sickness 2 winters before. Grief had carved itself into him, leaving marks that would never fade. In that moment, something shifted between them, quiet and irreversible. The gulf of fear and belief that had once stood between them began, little by little, to close. Elira Wayne, raised in comfort and certainty, and Kor, a hardened warrior carrying the weight of loss and duty, found a fragile meeting point in their shared will to endure. What had begun as captivity no longer felt so clearly defined. It was changing, quietly, steadily, into something Elira could not yet name. She was no longer merely a prisoner. She had become a witness to a world slipping toward erasure, a way of life rich with meaning and spirit. With awe and unease, she began to sense that the man who claimed her freedom might also be the one who showed her what freedom truly was. Then, without warning, everything shattered. The war party came like a mountain storm, sudden, savage, unstoppable. They poured into the clearing at dawn, faces streaked with paint twisted into masks of rage. Their war cries ripped through the valley, a chilling chorus that echoed off stone and snow. They were not of Kor's people. They were Red Elk Raiders, longtime enemies of the Skyhorn clan, their hatred forged through generations of bloodshed, worsened by vanishing hunting grounds and the tightening grip of the white man's world. Kor was awake in an instant, alerted by the faintest sound, a snapped twig, a whisper out of place. From sleep to lethal readiness, he moved as one. His bow was in his hands, eyes burning with battle fire. Without hesitation, he shoved Elira behind the scant shelter of a boulder, shielding her with his own body. "Stay down," he ordered, his voice sharp with urgency. Chaos erupted. The Red Elk Raiders surged forward, war clubs and tomahawks flashing in the cold morning light. Kor met them head-on, fierce and unrelenting. He moved with deadly precision, arrows striking true, each shot final. When they closed in, his knife became an extension of his will, flashing in brutal, intimate combat. Elira watched, breath trapped in her chest, horror and awe colliding inside her. She saw Kor cut down one attacker, Then another, his movements controlled, lethal, almost beautiful in their efficiency. But he was badly outnumbered. For every warrior he felled, another rushed in. She saw the moment his strength wavered. A tomahawk whirled through the air, meant for his skull, slicing instead into his shoulder. Blood sprayed across the untouched snow. He staggered, and in that instant, 2 red elk warriors lunged for him, their faces lit with savage triumph. A raw scream tore from Elira's throat. She was no fighter. She had never held a weapon meant for war, but she could not watch Cord die. Driven by terror and something fiercer still, she seized a burning log from the fire pit. Pain exploded through her palms as the heat scorched her skin, but she did not slow. With a desperate cry, she charged. She swung the log with all her strength, smashing it into the back of one warrior's legs. He collapsed with a howl, giving Cord the opening he needed. Cord struck without hesitation, driving his knife home, then turning to face the next attacker. His eyes met Elira's for a heartbeat, wild, fierce, alive. The fight raged on, savage and desperate. Elira, gripping her smoldering weapon, fought beside him with a ferocity she had never known she possessed, no longer just a captive, but a woman fighting for survival in a world that would show no mercy. She was no longer Elira Wayne, the sheltered daughter raised behind fine doors and careful rules. She had become something feral and unyielding, a cornered creature fighting for her own life, and for the man who, against all reason, had become her shield. Just as the last 2 attackers closed in, ready to finish them, a new sound tore through the chaos, the thunder of hooves and sharp, answering war cries. San, Cord's younger brother, burst into the clearing with warriors of the Skyhorn clan, drawn by the clash of steel and screams. The battle turned in a heartbeat. Outmatched and stunned, the Red Elk raiders broke ranks and fled, their retreat as wild and frantic as their assault. They vanished into the trees like angry spirits, leaving the clearing soaked in blood and smoke. The snow churned and stained, breakup thick with the scent of fire and death. Cord, battered and bleeding from several wounds, stood tall amid the wreckage, chest heaving as his eyes swept the ground with grim certainty. Then he looked at Elira. She stood there shaking, breath ragged, her face streaked with soot and blood, dress torn beyond recognition. Her eyes burned with shock, fear, and a fierce, almost unbelieving exhilaration. Slowly, something rare crossed Cord's face. A faint, astonished smile that softened the hard lines grief had carved into him. "You fight like a she-bear defending her cubs, little bird," he said, his voice carrying a new and unmistakable respect. As the sun finally pierced the clouds, pouring gold across the ruined clearing, Elira understood that her life had shifted beyond return. She was no longer a captive, she was a survivor. And somehow, in the most unlikely place, the brutal, untamed heart of the American West, she had found something that felt like home. The aftermath was quiet and grim. The warriors of the Skyhorn clan moved with practiced solemnity, tending their wounded, including Cord, whose shoulder gash was deep, and honoring their fallen. 2 of their own had died in the opening chaos. With the rush of battle gone, Elira felt the full weight of what she was seeing. This was the truth of this land, raw and unforgiving. Here, life and death were divided by the narrowest breath. By chance, by a single misstep. Cord, his shoulder tightly bound with clean cloths provided by San, moved among his people with calm authority. Even injured, his presence steadied them. He spoke in their language, his low voice easing grief and restoring order. Then Cord and his younger brother approached Elira. San was younger, his face less worn by years of struggle, but the same quiet strength lived in his eyes. He studied her, not as a prisoner, not as an outsider, but with open curiosity and respect. "You fought with the heart of a warrior, little bird," he said, using the name Kor had given her. From him, it sounded different. Less like possession, more like belonging. "My brother was right to see your strength. The story of the white woman who fought with fire will be spoken around our fires." The simple honesty of his words struck deeper than any polished praise she had known before. Here, she was not measured by her name or her beauty, but by what she had done when everything was at stake. The journey to the main Skyhorn clan village took 3 days. Elira rode one of the spare horses, her ankle still too weak to carry her far on foot. As she followed Kor and his people deeper into a world she was only beginning to understand. As they traveled, Elira Wayne felt herself slipping further into their world. She listened as the warriors spoke, her ears slowly learning the cadence of their language. San, far more talkative than his brother, often rode beside her, pointing out ridgelines, streams, and sacred places, naming them in the tongue of the Skyhorn clan. He shared stories of hunts and spirits bound to the rocks and rivers they passed, tales rooted so deeply in the land that they felt inseparable from it. She began to see a living landscape, heavy with memory and meaning, nothing like the way her father and men like him viewed the land as something to be claimed, surveyed and stripped bare. The village of the Skyhorn clan spread across a sheltered, sun-warmed valley, a wide encampment of painted lodges alive with motion. It pulsed with the steady rhythm of daily life. Laughter rang out as children ran between the lodges. Dogs barked. The dull, constant thump of women working hides carried through the air. As their party rode in, a wave of attention followed them. Elira felt hundreds of eyes on her, some wary, some curious, a few openly hostile. Her pale skin and torn, unfamiliar clothing stood in sharp contrast to the burnished copper tones, buckskin, and beadwork surrounding her. She was an oddity, an outsider. But Kor, returning as a respected war leader, stood for her. That night, before the council fire, he told the elders everything. He spoke of finding her alone in the mountains, like a bird with a shattered wing, close to death. He spoke of the weeks she had spent as his captive, her endurance, her quiet strength, her growing respect for their ways. And finally, his voice carrying unmistakable pride, he told of her courage during the attack by the Red Elk Raiders. He lifted the scorched sleeve of his tunic. "She did this," he said simply, "not for herself, but for one of us. Her heart is strong." His words, delivered with calm authority, carried weight. The hard suspicion in the elders' faces eased, replaced by reluctant acceptance. Elira was given a lodge of her own, small, sturdy, and warm, which she soon began to make her home. The women of the clan, cautious at first, slowly opened to her. An elder named Omi, her eyes deep with the wisdom of many winters, took Elira under her care. She taught her their skills, their crafts, their words. Elira learned to tan hides until they softened beneath her hands, to stitch beads into patterns rich with meaning, to cook the clan's food over open flame. She learned the names of healing plants, the turning of the seasons, and the quiet laws of the land that had nearly taken her life. In doing so, she discovered a sense of purpose she had never known within the stifling rooms of her father's house. Here, worth was measured by effort and character, not by dowry or name. She was no longer a piece on a wealthy man's board, no longer a bird behind gilded bars. She was part of something larger, contributing to the life of the people around her. She was home. Months passed. The deep snows of winter melted into the vivid green of spring. Then one day, a rider entered the village. A white man. A trader who sometimes served as a messenger. His name was Calder Rusk, and he carried a letter that had traveled between forts and trading posts for months. It was for Elira. Her heart hammered as she broke the wax seal, her fingers unsteady. The elegant script was unmistakable. Her father's hand, now strange and distant. The words inside were tangled with anger, relief, and desperation. A plea for her return that reached across the miles from a world she was no longer sure was hers. He wrote of his humiliation, of the scandal her disappearance had unleashed across the territory. He wrote of Rasker Holt's consuming rage, of the bounty placed on her return. A staggering sum. No questions asked. The letter closed with words that cut deeper than all the rest. Your mother fades without you. Come home and everything will be forgiven. The page trembled in Elira Wayne's hands. It was a brutal reminder of the world she had escaped. A world of wealth and protection. Yes. But also one of suffocating control and a future stripped of choice. She lifted her eyes from the letter and looked around her. Painted lodges glowing in the afternoon light, children laughing along the riverbank, the vast, snow-crowned mountains that had once been her prison and were now her refuge. In that moment, she knew, with steady resolve. She took a piece of charcoal and a strip of smooth birch bark Calder Rusk had given her. She wrote back to her father. She told him she was alive. She told him she was no longer afraid. She told him she had found a new life, a new home, and a family bound not by obligation, but by choice. She wrote of Bryn Wayne with tenderness and grief. Yet she knew returning would not save her mother. It would only doom them both to the same quiet erasure. She ended with words that felt final and true. I am not the daughter you lost. I am a woman who has found herself. I am not coming back. She handed the letter to the trader and watched him ride away, his figure shrinking against the endless land. As he vanished into the horizon, a deep calm settled over her. The last thread tying her to her former life had been cut. When she turned, Cor stood at the entrance of her lodge. He had seen everything. He did not ask what the letter said. He did not question her choice. He simply waited, his dark eyes filled with understanding. He walked toward her, unhurried, the setting sun casting gold across the valley and outlining him in light. When he took her hand, his touch held no trace of possession, only steadiness, warmth, and promise. You belong with us now, little bird, he said quietly. Your path is here. Elira met his gaze and saw not a warrior, not a captor, but a man who had recognized her strength before she had learned to trust it herself. The man who had given her shelter, purpose, and love. I know, she said, her voice calm and certain. I am home. In the fierce, untamed heart of the American West. A woman who fled a gilded cage and was claimed by a warrior had found her true destiny. She had claimed her freedom. She had claimed her place. And she had claimed her heart. Yet her story was not finished. The shadows of her past still stretched long. Rasker Holt, wealthy and obsessed. And Merton Wayne, a father who would not easily forget. Beyond that, the world of the Skyhorn clan faced its own dangers as the advancing nation pressed ever closer. What trials would she and Core face together? How long could their hard-won peace endure as two worlds continue to collide? Those answers still waited on the horizon. Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. Your presence means more than you know. If today's story awakened something inside you, don't let the trail end here. There are many more tales of courage, devotion, and faith waiting to be discovered. Subscribe, comment, share, and come back as we continue this unforgettable journey. Thank you, truly. Aviso legal. Disclaimer. All stories are intended solely for entertainment and may include fictionalized scenarios or dramatization derived from historical contexts. While AI assists in production, human creators supervise and adjust every piece to maintain sincerity, credibility, and emotional quality. We adhere entirely to platform regulations regarding AI content, ensuring no deepfakes or misleading portrayals. Licensed materials are used responsibly. Republishing, modifying, or extracting content without authorization is not allowed. We appreciate every viewer who respects originality and creative effort.